and I'm joined by my colleague Bob Evans. For the last 38 years, as I've just been informed, give or take a day, Bob has been the chief scientist, curator, and much more for the recovery of the immense amount of gold that was on the SS Central America, which was making its way from Panama to New York with a commercial trove. And I'm going to be very careful to distinguish something here, because Robert and I have discussed two different types of recovery of gold and valuables from the ship. The one that gets all the press is the amount of ingot and gold that was being sent to New York to bolster the banks, which were already teetering a little bit. That's the 1.7 million, give or take a penny, that today would be worth $50 million, that was supposed to buttress and basically stabilize the banks, which were not regulated at all by the federal government in 1857. So when that ship went down, the banks became even less stable, causing the Panic of '57, which we'll get into. There was a lot of private wealth on that ship. It cost just to travel from San Francisco across Panama and to New York in 1857 dollars, somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000, which would be up to $75,000 in today's money, to go on that trip. And a lot of the people carried their wealth with them. Now, according to one article, Bob, I haven't verified this with Bob, so here's his chance. It is estimated that there was as much private wealth on the ship as there was commercial money on the ship. And the money that some people had was in private money belts and vests. They carried the money with them in California all the time for safety and security. And when 425 fairly wealthy people perished on that boat, their private wealth was scattered about, and Bob described maybe an area 3 by 3 would have small pockets of small change and gold. And I do remember, Bob, there was a great deal of foreign gold that you found that was a private wealth, right?
It's all true.
Okay, so there was still a lot of foreign gold in 1857 circulating in California. The Coin Act of 1857 had made foreign money not legal tender anymore, but gold, as Bob had put in one article, gold is gold. People accepted it no matter what. So if you're carrying a U.S. gold coin or a Spanish gold coin or Portugal gold coin, everybody was still willing to do a transaction with you. As long as someone would take the money, it's just like private Civil War tokens. As long as people were willing to accept it, they couldn't take it to the bank, but they could still do their own transactions, and gold obviously had a great intrinsic value. So part of what the more recent thing that Bob has been involved in has been analyzing and curating a great deal of private personal wealth. And I know he recalled in one of the Versa's safes there was 9,000 silver dimes, Liberty-seated silver dimes, that they used to make payroll. And payroll at that time was, if you were a sailor, you made a whopping $5 a month, and you were paid in dimes. And that's just the way it was. And they had lots and lots of gold dust, which is the way a lot of the transactions took place.
That's the reason there were a lot of abandoned ships in San Francisco Harbor.
Yeah. So, anyway, the bottom line is, I'm going to skip forward a little bit and talk to you a little bit about Sherman and the connection between Sherman and all this California gold. Not specifically about that ship, other than the fact that William T. Sherman lost his job when that ship went down. As a young man, Uncle Billy, as he was known after the Civil War, I'll call him Uncle Billy just to be familiar, he was out on a military attachment to what was Yerba Buena, and it wasn't even San Francisco yet, in 1848. And the thing that he wrote in his memoirs was, he heard about placer gold being found in Sutter's Mill, but nobody put much value on gold yet. The thing that was valuable in California being mined was, of all things, quicksilver or mercury. And there was a big mine called the Amalda Mine, I believe. Oldest mine in California, 1845, and it originally had been created in the California area, which was not technically a territory, had been Mexican. And so the whole area had been mined by the Mexican government to process silver. And that's what they needed the quicksilver for. Now, I had no appreciation for how important quicksilver was, but when it came to mining gold and when it came to processing it in the sluice, they needed that to attract or to hold on to a lot of invaluable materials and help to process the black sand out and keep the gold. So this guy I think the guy that created the mines for quicksilver actually ended up being like so wealthy that he created one of the biggest banks. I can't remember which one. I thought it was Bank of America. I looked it up. It wasn't him. But there are a couple of names that were associated with the mine that, when you read in some details, these guys were very savvy, and they made a ton of money. Okay, you know what?
Darius Ogden Mills was one of the founders of the Bank of California at the time.
Okay.
And he owned he was partial owner with his brothers of the New Albanon quicksilver mines, just outside of San Francisco.
Right, yeah. Thank you. So anyway, Uncle Billy became very infatuated. He actually was one of the first people to hold placer gold in his hands, and one of the purposes of the military at that time in California, it became a state in 1850, but up until that time, what was happening was he was in charge, along with other people more important to him, in enforcing mining laws in California. So he had to inspect mines and placer gold, which is the gold found in streams, and then he would have to determine with the other military authority who had the rights to those mines, Mexico or the United States of America. And of course, Mexico lost the American-Mexican War, and so the state of California, ultimately became a state, and that changed the ball game in terms of the authority to process that gold and send it to the United States government starting in 1850. And of course, Billy himself said, I of course could not escape the infection. So he got gold fever like everyone else, and by the time the gold really started to roll in 1850 or so, and the state of California was created, he decided to stay. He, for a short time, forfeited his military, what do they call it again? There's a word for it.
Pension?
Yeah. And fortunately, he didn't give up on it altogether, which I'll get back to it ultimately. This is a really interesting picture, plus the quote here. Captains and crews, this is his words, abandoned their ships in the San Francisco harbor to go and mine gold. And they say that there were so many ships that were literally abandoned that part of the city of San Francisco was built on the remains and wreckage of all those ships that were left in the harbor. It's amazing to me. I mean, it was like nuts for a while. In 1848, no one cared about gold, and they were scratching their head. Why is that so important? 2 years later, the city of San Francisco is born, and every ship in the world wants to go there to sell somebody something, because, I mean, obviously, let's face it, most merchants made more money off of mining operations than the mines themselves for most guys. Not everybody, but if you had something to sell, like a shovel or a pick, boy, you were cleaning up then. Now, here's a story about Billy that I'm eager to tell you, because, and when Bob has a chance, we'll get into the weight of gold. But Billy worked for a bank called Lucas Turner. And by the middle of the 1800s, the gold rush was getting a little rocky. Foreign investors were pulling out. There wasn't very much diversification in banking, and a lot of sectors were starting to fail. And Billy's bank was one of them that was hitting hard times in 1855, 2 years before the big panic of 1857. Now I bring this up to you because one of his jobs, and this kind of tells you a little something about his character in a good way, he was told to go out and collect as much money on overdue debt as he possibly could because the bank had a run of $75,000 and they needed the money fast. And the U.S. Custom House was being built, and of course that's financed by Uncle Sam, and that was one of the bigger debts that were owed to the bank. And I don't know what shenanigans and what strings who pulled where, but Uncle Billy managed to take himself with one horse and saddlebags down to the San Francisco Mint, which had just opened, and he collected $40,000 in gold coins, $20 gold coins each. Now that weighs about 140 pounds to tote that much money. $40,000 in 1855 is $1 million today. And that guy was willing to take one horse, one pistol, go down to the mint, collect $1 million in saddlebags, and take it back to his bank. And he said he cut the deal the night before and he had the money in the bank before it opened the next morning, saving the bank. So that is a pretty cool story, and shows you how important gold coins, $20 gold pieces specifically, are. And it ties in directly with Bob and the ship because the incredible amount of gold coin that was found were all minted at the San Francisco Mint, and there are 2 or 3 of them that were in like mint state 67. I mean, something unbelievable. And I think, Bob, can you tell me roughly what they sold for, the very best specimens of those $20 gold pieces, roughly, give or take?
I'm not really a values guy. I concern myself more with what things are and what they mean rather than what they're worth. They're in the 6 figures type ranges, up in the hundreds of thousands for the very top line double eagles from the Central America. So I don't know is the correct answer.
A lot of it was only like 1927D, St. Garden. Double eagles
Yeah,
are around,
you
those
know.
are going for like 2.5, 3.5.
Yeah, the ones that, there was practically an event last September when we opened up the contents of the last treasured box that I had kept as an intact artifact. It had been on display in the Ship of Gold exhibit that toured around and all of this kind of thing. There were 123 double eagles that were still arrayed in this remains of a box. And there's a NGC video out there that you can link to and see me excavate it and work on it and talk about it and all that. But among those coins, because we don't know who the consignor had been at the mint, but it kind of obviously looks like it was some business that had gone to the mint with their gold. The mint had recently suffered a die clash among the dies, and so they had polished the die clash out of this, creating proof-like coins out of the dies that were then struck. You can see just a little remnant of a clash mark in the scroll work on the back. You can see a bit of Liberty's nose and forehead coming through there. So we can kind of trace, okay. At the time, it would have made a terrible racket in the mint when these things clashed. And immediately there would have been inferior coin being produced. So the mint operator at the time, the pressman, would have stopped everything, would have collected up the inferior coinage to be sent back and remelted and turned into things like that. And then they had to deal with, okay, are these dies bad forever? Or are we going to get the roughly 70 or 80,000 strikes out of these things that are expected of us? And we can actually tell that from the Central America treasure too, how many they must have been producing if you divide the total year's stuff by the number of dies they had. It works out somewhere in there between 70 and 100,000 strikings per set of dies. So anyway, this incredible set of circumstances where, okay, once they started producing, once they had polished the dies to the point where they said, okay, these will work, then they put them back into production, and they were producing proof-like coins for that first couple of hundred or so that were in that, and 20 of them ended up in this box because those coins had just gone into the inventory of the mint. They weren't anything special. They were business strikes, and they put them there, and this business must have brought their gold deposit to the mint shortly after that. The mint took those coins and gave them to that in payment for the deposit. And then they boxed them up in this box that included those coins plus a number of other dates to the exact amount of $3,000. We can tell that from the dimensions of the box, that this box was made to hold 2 rows of 5 stacks each of 15 coins, which comes to $3,000 exactly. And so once that was sealed up and sealed with wax, once it was screwed shut and sealed with wax, it would have been just traded as a $3,000 bill, basically. You know, that you could, if you were confident in the company that had made this and had marked it as $3,000, we can no longer see those markings. But then this would have traded as a large transactional amount of money, which is really the whole point of why the commercial shipment is so heavy in ingots as well. These were not usable on the street because they represented, you know, the value of a house, not the value of a loaf of bread. But that was the sort of large transactional money that was being used in the commercial shipment. That and boxes of double eagles. You had to get a lot of value in a single parcel, and so that's the way the stuff was packaged. And I've talked long enough now. I'm going to give it back to Rick.
Oh, you're great, man. I don't want to...
No, that's cool.
So we just wanted to show you, obviously, this is representative of the coins, but Bob, I pulled out an 1857 San Francisco coin. Now that was one of what you called the choice coins from the ship, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty nice looking double eagle.
Yeah. Okay.
I tell people, by the way, that because I was a geologist before I got involved in this, and I had the Whitman scent book when I was a little boy for about like 8 months or something. I was into that before I got into fossils and such like that. When I came back into numismatics, I came from the top down. I started with thousands of mint state double eagles. And then my interest and fascination with numismatics has spread out from there. It's a wonderful field.
Now, where we get a closer connection with Sherman before the ship sank, in his memoirs he does make a specific reference to having worked with the major assayers of the day. This one created a huge ingot, and the name is Just, that's Justh, and Hunter, and the other one was Kellogg. And he mentions both companies by name, said he did regular transactions with these companies on behalf of his bank in order to pay their bills in New York. Now, interestingly enough, those are precisely the ingots or type of ingots that were on the SS Central America when it went down. So he did have, and Bob verified this with me in his memoirs, a direct connection with the assay houses that were prominent at that time. So that's the other big connection with him prior to the ship sinking. This is really quite a story too, just to be human and anecdotal. The news of the day was this was an appalling disaster. 425 or more lives were lost. And the ship was sunk, by the way, way far north of where, in Sherman's day, they thought it sank near Savannah, Georgia. Thanks to the work that Bob and his team did, they found that the ship actually went down much further, like 200 miles off the shore of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in 8,000 feet of water. And I'm just going to jump ahead and say that in 1988, when the first expedition went to the ship, it was so deep, it was over a mile down in the water. The humans couldn't do it. They didn't even have the technology yet to have robotics do it. And one of the first group of investors actually put money into the robotics part of the recovery. And they were in the cutting edge in 1988 technology. Now they went back again with Bob.
2014.
A different group of investors, yeah, 2014.
2014.
Technology is infinitely better for going down to those depths and detecting metal, and they found many, many more small objects and tiny coins, like, I don't know if you've heard of them, but $quarter gold pieces, which are tiny. They're almost like a fish scale. They're so tiny. And, you know, they never could have found that in 1988, but they did find them in 2014. Now, when the ship did go down, in the news, it was reported that only 60 lives were saved. And the story that goes with that, which is really, you know, from a human standpoint, is really cool. They say that there was a bark, a ship, from Scandinavia that was going from Honduras back to Scandinavia. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this kind of a big bird. I forget the name of the darn thing, but
Albatross?
well, no, actually, but you're close. There's another name for it. It has this unusual ability to puff up in the front.
The bird was identified at the time as a frigate pelican, but it's a frigate bird.
Ah, okay.
Then,
Okay.
and they are known for their acrobatic feats of soaring just above things and being able to, like, you know, pick up the popcorn from people on the beach and stuff, you know,
Right.
without even landing. And this bird was, I'll tell this story.
You want to tell it? Go ahead, man. Because Sherman actually
Captain Anders Jansen of the Norwegian bark Ellen said that, you know, this bird had flown at him 3 times, and he considered it an omen, and so he slightly altered his course. And then shortly after that, he heard cries from the night. It's dark out there. There's no lights out at sea. A storm has just passed, so there must not have been much in the way of moon or stars or anything like that either. And he said, I found myself among men who had been shipwrecked. And over the course of the next 7 or 8 hours, they managed to rescue another 50 men from the water who had no chance of salvation whatsoever. Now, this poor frigate bird, mind you, after it had flown at him like 3 times, he said basically he had it struck down and its remains thrown overboard. But he still got to thinking about it and thought, well, maybe that was an omen. Maybe I ought to, like, change things. So, yeah, the Central America story is full of lots of interesting, strange sidelights.
Yeah. And going back to Sherman, it all ties together. He was in a hotel in New York when the captain of that bark stopped there to report about the people that he had saved and the story about the bird. And so General Sherman, or at the time, Uncle Billy, actually had the chance to meet the captain of this ship and heard the story firsthand, which I think is pretty cool. That these things kept intersecting with Sherman's life, so he had personal firsthand contact with the captain that encountered this bird. So after the ship sank, after the Panic of '57, the Bank of Lucas Turner failed both in San Francisco and in New York, and poor Uncle Billy lost his job and forevermore never had a job in the financial community. So his life was altered completely by the sinking of that ship, and he had to make his way eventually to the state of Louisiana just in time for succession. And one story I'd like to tell you about Louisiana, which, by the way, most of the people that he knew, he was hired to run a small military academy north of the city of New Orleans. And of course he had very strong northern sentiments. Hardly another soul that he was with had anywhere close to the same sentiments. What made matters worse for him in Louisiana was his brother John of Ohio, by then I think was a senator, was a very ardent abolitionist, and everyone assumed that William had the same political bent as his brother John, which made him even more of an outcast, even though arguably Uncle Billy was more of a how do I put it? He was very strongly opinionated that the nation shouldn't be broken up, even though most of his colleagues in the South thought it could be done like an amicable divorce. They really didn't think there would be war, but they thought, hey, what the heck, we can take every northern asset that we have. So they took over arsenals, all the mints, including the New Orleans Mint, and the Dahlonega Mint, and the Charlotte Mint, and anything and everything that had USA stamped on it. He remembered going in to visit a friend who was a quartermaster in New Orleans, and the place was filled with boxes and crates of weapons and food and everything else. And the United States of America had been printed on every single box, and then they just slapped Confederate States of America on each and every box. And they said, hey, what the heck, it's ours. And, you know, that didn't set too well with Sherman. But anyway, what I wanted to tell you about the New Orleans Mint is, unlike Dahlonega and Charlotte, which were only producing gold coins, not too many at the time, New Orleans was a very powerful mint. We lost 3 out of 5 mints in the north to production. Everyone says, oh, everyone's hoarding. Well, yeah, that's true. But when you lose half of your production, New Orleans was every bit as big as Philadelphia. And what do you do? You have half as many coins being made. Well, anyway, bottom line is, what you find in the New Orleans half-dollar story is, for the first month of succession, the United States of America still managed to produce about 300,000 half-dollars. As soon as Louisiana seceded, they came to the door of the mint and said, hey, it's ours. It's not the Confederate States of America. It belongs to the state of Louisiana. They made sure that every person that worked at the mint had to stay on. That's a long story, which I won't bore you with, but they wanted everyone to sign an oath of allegiance to the Confederate States of America. Not everyone would, but they were forced to stay for a while. They produced another 1 million half-dollars, identical to the ones for the same dies. And then eventually Louisiana became part of the Confederate States of America, and yet another 600,000 or so Confederate half-dollars were made, but they all looked almost identical. There was all the same personnel, the same mint, the same dies. The dies were beginning to fail, so some people will argue they can see these subtle changes in the coin. But anyway, I just wanted to let you guys know that it's sort of an interesting study to see if you own a USA, Louisiana, or Confederate States of America half-dollar. And then, of course, there was the famous Confederate half-dollar, which was struck for 4 men, including Jeff Davis, and that was taken from him when he was captured. And I think that the last one that sold went for $1.7 million, give or take. This was a fractional note, 15 cents, produced by the U.S. Treasury in 1866 to honor Sherman and Grant, who were considered to be the biggest heroes of the day. Now, I don't know if you knew about this, but in 1866, a law passed the United States Congress, and it said no image of any person living is going to be allowed on American currency. Now, that was kind of ironic because the whole purpose of having people's images on currency when it started in 1862, Abe Lincoln was on the money, and by the way, Abe Lincoln is the only president that appeared on money when he was living and when he was deceased. Kind of unusual, that's it. But the other story is that went into production. There was going to be millions of them, and it was outlawed. And some people argue it's because some people felt it was too vain. Some people argued that only European nations have kings and emperors and all that jazz on their money, and we're no, we don't allow that sort of thing. I've seen every argument under the sun. But that's a really handsome note, but it never truly you can still find them. I don't know how and where. I don't know what happened to them after they were minted, but the Treasury pulled them back. Maybe a few made it in circulation. I really don't know the full story. Now, I have one more note, and it's not in here, but I'll just tell you about it. Yeah. Oh, well. This is the abbreviated version. After Sherman died in 1892, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing proposed a $500 bill with
The
a
all-important
much older
charger.
Sherman on it. And for reasons, again, that I can't find, it was never printed. So Uncle Billy had two shots at being on currency, this one and the $500 banknote, and it disappeared. Now, after that, when he did die, this is sort of a carom shot to tell you more stories. There's a lot more of this stuff in the book about St. Gaudens. He was commissioned by Theodore Roosevelt to create this incredibly beautiful statue to honor William Sherman. It's close to Central Park in New York. It was looking pretty ratty, and just very recently they completely restored it with fresh new gild.
That's a
But what I
6
wanted
foot.
to show you, it's in the book, like I said, in a lot more detail. The woman who represents victory, Sherman, of course, is a seated gentleman. That same image, that same statue, is the inspiration for the $20 gold piece with the Walking Liberty that came out after Sherman's death. And of course, as you know, I'm not saying there's a direct connection between the two, but one thing I can comment on is that Theodore Roosevelt was a huge fan of ancient coins, specifically Greek coins, and he loved high relief. And you guys probably know the story a lot better than me. I'm not an expert on contemporary U.S. coins, but they tried to create about, 17,000, 20,000 high relief $20 gold pieces with that beautiful Walking Liberty. But it wore the presses down or the dies down too quickly. It was not practical. And no one's going to sit around and striking coins by hand anymore like they did in ancient Greece. So the bottom line is, it went back to the normal thing. And the one other little story that I just want to tell you that does tie into the Civil War, not to Sherman, but in 1864, when they outlawed private Civil War tokens and a number of other things, they authorized the phrase, "In God we trust," for the first time. Our founding fathers were not wild about the notion of having anything that dealt with God on our coins, and Theodore Roosevelt was someone who thought it was sacrilegious to put the name of the Lord onto a coin which was purely for commercial purposes.
In God we trust, all others pay cash.
Yes, thank you. All those pay cash. You're right. You're right. So the reason I bring that up to you is that those $20 Walking gold double eagles in I think it was 1907 and 1908. Does that sound right to you? They're the 2 years that "In God We Trust" was taken off of the gold coins by the direction of the President of the United States.
Well, left off.
Left off? Is that the right way? Okay.
Because they made new dies, they just didn't put it on.
I see. Okay. Congress, there are members of Congress that wanted it to be restored. And, we don't really appreciate this, but E pluribus unum was still our national motto at that time. So "In God We Trust" and E pluribus unum kind of existed side by side. It wasn't until the 1950s that "In God We Trust" became the national motto. And the two phrases still coexist with each other. But all this goes back to the genius of St. Gaudens. To me, is an incredibly beautiful statue. And again, when you see the artist's original drawings, which we have some in the book, and the original three-dimensional sculptor, it's not a three-dimensional figure yet, but he did everything in relief. And you can clearly see that it's the same basic figure that ended up on the coins themselves. But it all started to honor General Sherman. So I just thought you guys should know that. Do you have any other comments about, for example, the assayers and those incredible ingots, which I do reference that?
I've been listening.
Okay.
The ingots, to me, we've been discussing the ingots because Sherman made reference to Justin, to Kellogg. These things, what the SS Central America teaches us is there were 5 assayers, and only 5, which is interesting, that show up in the commercial treasure on the Central America. These were obviously firms that were trusted because it's a tremendous amount of money. The ingots ranged in size from 4.95 ounces, tiny little guy, but still like $94 of gold, up to 933 ounces, which I hurt myself every time I handle that ingot. It weighs almost 70 pounds of standard pounds, almost 80 troy pounds. Basically like a sack of Quikrete or something in a package the size of a loaf of bread, or a small loaf of bread, actually. Each of them has exactly the 5 pieces of information you need on something in order for it to act as a piece of money. There is a serial number, which tells you that there's an accounting system, basically, and that serial number corresponds with the paper documents that go along with the ingot. There's an assayer's mark. In the case of the ones that Sherman referred to, it would have been Just and Hunter. Hunter actually ran the Marysville office of the Just and Hunter. Marysville up in the Gold Rush country itself, up in the foothills. I was actually near there just 2 weeks ago. Or Kellogg and Humbert. Humbert was another giant in finance then, initially the United States assayer of gold in San Francisco, and he and Kellogg, another financial giant, had banded together to make up what was really the largest amount of gold. I mean, it's their name, not the United States government's name, that is on the largest weight of gold that has come from the Central America. The ingots in the commercial shipment actually made up 87% of the total. So that's how important ingots were to large transactional commercial shipment like this. Anyway, back to the ingots themselves. It has a serial number and an assayer's mark, and then the number of troy ounces to the 100th of a troy ounce, the purity expressed as fine, which is parts per thousand. This is very key, and it's what the assayer is really doing. The assayer takes chips from the corners of the ingots, and then he determines how much gold is in that chip versus how much of other metals are in that chip. In the case of California gold, it is almost all entirely silver that is not gold. And so the silver is removed from this, and then the gold is weighed against the original weight of the chips, and you can determine the purity to the 1,000th. The chips were taken from opposite corners, and 2 different assays were done on those, and they had to agree, or else it was all thrown back into the pot and we're going to start over again, because the idea would be to have it freely mixed to the point where you get a true value for this lump of gold. After the true value was determined, say, 913 fine or 828 fine or whatever it might be, and they range from somewhere around 60% fine up to 97% fine. But most of them are around that 88, 89, 90, right in that range. The dollar value was stamped on the ingot as well. That dollar value calculated at $20.67.2 per ounce. They calculated this to the mill, so not just to the cent. I've seen like this $20.67 starts showing up in standard numismatic references around the turn of the 20th century. They start quoting it, and then it's gotten quoted over and over again. But back in 1842, Eckfeldt and Dubois, who wrote a book for the U.S. Mint and for the government about actually gold and silver coins of all nations, is what it was called. They have a table in which they point out that it was actually $20.67.2, or so $20.672 mils per ounce. This always puzzled me until I found that the Central America ingot algebra doesn't work out quite right. If you take the purity times the ounces, it was always a few cents short, and a few cents shorter the larger the ingot got. Once I started plugging in the $20.672 mils, it made sense. The math works. That math, by the way, was also an interesting way to proofread the ingots and all of your, the entries into databases and things like that, because if it didn't work out that way, you'd read a number wrong somewhere. The ingots, to me, also are fascinating because they're not only a piece of money, but they are a financial document that documents a financial transaction between the depositor, and here it is inscribed in gold on the ingot itself. It would have reflected what the paper would have said. No paper exists that has been found that actually lines up perfectly with any SS Central America ingots. So we have some Kellogg and Humbert paper from 1858. I think it's from January or February. Fred Hollibird, who's a sometimes colleague of mine, has chased down some like that, but we haven't got back to August of 1857, which is where we would find. It'd be great if you could actually find that in some attic somewhere. Find some assay paper from that reflected bars on the Central America. It'd be great. But they were immensely important bars. As a curator and a cataloger of these things, I'm also very happy to report that makes them all unique. And basically, how much better is it for a curator when a serial number is stamped on the thing? I mean, you don't have to put any marks on it or anything else. Okay, this is ingot number 672, and it has these characteristics. And they're wonderful things because they're one step removed from the original raw gold dust. They represent gold dust that went to these assayers. It was then melted and all determined. And so, it's practically just like the very first form of precise money that most of the gold in California took. The first thing to do would be to melt it in an ingot and determine its purity, even if it went to the mint. Now, we don't have any mint bars. We've got bars from Kellogg and Humbert, from Justin Hunter, from Blake and Company in Sacramento, from Harris Marchand and Company in Sacramento and Marysville, and from, is that all 5 of them? That's 4. I'm missing somebody. Oh, Hench and Company. Hench was a Swiss assayer. Most of these guys had been trained in Europe because that's where all the big mining schools were and stuff at Freiburg and places like that. So a lot of European immigrants came here with skills ready to become assayers, and it was a very lucrative business. They charged different seigniorage depending on how fast they would turn things around. Could be anywhere from 0.5% to 1.5%, and it's a whole lot of money when you start adding up the number of ingots that were involved.
Just give the folks your impression when you first saw the Garden of Gold.
Well, the commercial shipment area was first discovered on ectochrome. It's strange to talk about one's career back in the 1980s at this point. I was a much younger man. But what happened was on our 3rd dive, something like that, we had a fairly long survey pass over the main pile of the shipwreck. And then there was a guy who, he did various things, but one of his jobs was to develop the film. Yes, we were developing actual film. We had two 300 exposure canisters of ectochrome that were on the robot, Nemo, we called the robot, and we would shoot photographs that would give us much higher resolution than what the cameras we were using would give us at the time. We got better cameras the next year, slightly better, although still not anything like what they are now. But there was this one exposure that John Doring was the gentleman's name. We had just launched the vehicle Nemo for the next dive, and he was sitting on the crane, which was his station. He actually lifted the vehicle and put it into the water, And my station was next to him, where I was ready with a tagline in case we had to bring it back. I had to snap this thing onto the side and lash it down, and this is the seamanship part of the adventure, I guess. But the point was that John had just was about to lift the vehicle up, and there was some kind of pause in the thing, and he beckoned for me to come closer. And John said to me, "Bob, when we're done putting Nemo in the water, go into the dark room and check out what's on the light table." And I kind of looked at him, and he had this sort of Cheshire cat grin on his face. And he said, "And bring a change of underwear." And the one that really struck me, and the one that I first saw, was there was a beam that was literally dripping with double eagles. It was jutted out over about a meter or so above the seabed. It was one of the frame members of the Central America, and somehow or other, a sack of double eagles or a box of double eagles had collapsed down onto the site, onto this beam, and then degraded. And so over time, it got to the point where these were just spilling over the edge. And what an incredible sight. The very next dive, we landed near that, and we blew off the area with we have a thruster on Nemo that we can turn around and train to waft away the sediment and such. And this is what was exposed to us on the photograph here, and we have, degraded boxes of double eagles. You've got some pioneer coinage in there. You've got gold dust. You've got assayer's ingots. There's even a few silver coins mixed in there. And you can see the whole mix of what a very chaotic but still very beautiful deposit was. So that was my first experience with seeing the gold was actually on a light table looking at ectochrome with a loop, But on the next dive, when we blew that area off, there was sort of pandemonium in the control room because it's exactly what we were looking for.